This is Do Good and Do Well, the podcast for people who want to make a positive difference in the world without losing themselves in the process. I'm Sarah Fox, and in this podcast, I'll be sharing stories from social and creative entrepreneurs and leaders to help inspire you to do good and do well. Hello, how are you today? In this episode, I'm talking to Keri Jarvis. Keri is an ICF accredited developmental coach for life and work in the Polycrisis. She helps people to reimagine their relationships with themselves, their work, and the world, expanding their capacity for contribution and satisfaction. Keri is also the co-founder of Southend Care Bank, alleviating the impact of hygiene poverty and redistributing pre-loved resources. In this episode, we wanted to share some thinking around how we might all develop more capacity and satisfaction in a world where everything feels so urgent and so important. And as you'll hear, we don't really get to 3 easy steps. Sorry about that. But we do manage to share a few ideas about how we might all be able to move through the world being more human, both to ourselves and to each other. And definitely we'd love you to feel kinder and more compassionate towards yourself. Hope you enjoy. Hello, Keri, and welcome to Do Good and Do Well. How are you today?
I'm okay. Thank you so much for having me.
Oh, you're welcome. I've been wanting to talk to you for so long, and I'm really glad that you are here. For those of the listeners who don't know you, I've done a brief intro. You sent me your bio. I've done that, but tell us more about you and kind of how you got to this place that you're at now.
Gosh, I always get this like massive wave of overwhelm whenever that
That's a big
question
question.
lands. So I'm an ICF accredited coach. My coaching is a blend of developmental approach, some parts work, some behavioral science stuff. And I work with people who are interested in really reimagining their relationships with their work, the world, themselves as we navigate this chapter of the Polycrisis. I'm also the co-founder of a charity, which is called Southend Care Bank, where we work to alleviate the impacts of hygiene poverty in the city where we live, and also to redistribute resources. How I've got here is some combination of my experiences of being radicalized in motherhood, my experiences of being radicalized by just basically like living in this country for the last 5 years in particular. I used to, in my old life, be a store manager for a major retailer. I had a very kind of, like mainstream outlook. And it's really over these past 5 to 10 years that I found myself deepening more and more into a sense of awareness, I suppose, and also just a sense of great concern for not just myself and my family, but all of our society and the world around us. So for the doom and gloom, despairing kickoff here, but that's about the truth of it.
I really enjoy hearing you describe that, for want of a better word, journey that you've been through that gets you to this point. I wonder how, when you hear yourself talk about it, what's going on for you as you describe it?
What's going on for me? I mean, at the minute, a lot of people are talking to me about this too, actually, this tension that we feel between, I feel really grateful to have the knowledge that I do, to have kind of the access to the ideas and the thinkers and the evidence that I do about the kind of material reality that we're in now and that's unfolding ahead of us. And also, I feel a kind of a grief and a sadness and a yearning for an alternative path where I just carried on like selling sprouts and knickers and just like, doing the things that normal people do, watching normal person TV and having normal conversations and normal ways that people spend their weekend. Of course, by normal, I just mean like mainstream, socially acceptable ways of being, rather than facing what I'm sure lots of people here are familiar with, like you find yourself in like the school playground, or I don't know, like a school football match, or at the shops or wherever else you might be, and people are like, oh, what are you doing later? Or what are you doing at the weekend? You're like, oh, I'm going to this protest, or I'm doing this redistribution drive, or whatever it is. So really the duality of that on one hand, like very, very grateful and would not actually choose anything else. On the other hand, like sometimes would actually quite like to have chosen something else, you know?
I absolutely know. It's from at home we've been watching The Silo. I don't know if you've seen it, but essentially there's humans that are living underground and they don't know a lot about what's outside, and a couple of people discover what's outside. And in the latest episode, it really reminded me of what you were saying, that they are happy, they know, but they also just want to go back to the silo and pretend that none of it's happening, and that they just like they know what they know, and that's all good. They can keep their eyes down, keep looking forward, and let's not look up and out. And I guess the other thing that I was thinking as you were talking was that I think one of the things I know I find tricky sometimes is that level of communication between people in terms of that sort of small talk, and then I'm wanting to kind of jump into the much deeper. Sometimes I know if I'm meeting someone new, I'm rubbish at small talk, and I want to know them. I want to know what they think. I want to know what their values are, and I want to know what they care about, and that can feel a bit confronting for people.
I think it's like really, I love that you brought that up. I think it's such like a day-to-day common experience for quote unquote people like us to enter into these social interactions where we know what's expected of us. We know we're supposed to be like, oh, how are your parents? Or like, what are you having for tea? Or did you have a nice weekend or whatever? And really, we want to be like, tell me what keeps you up at night, and like, what's
Yeah.
what's the most terrifying thought you've had this week?
Yeah.
What in your wildest imagination would our collective lives look like in 10 years' time? And knowing that we would be perceived to be like completely off our rockers, and to be like we would develop a reputation for being just having no awareness of like what's socially acceptable. And something that really supports me in that is that coming at that with like a sense of playfulness, like coming at that with, right, I know that the systems very deliberately sort of create this environment where small talk is what is socially normal, because it prevents us from discussing big ideas, and it prevents us from really seeing people that we're not kind of blood related to or like have personal friendships with. It stops us from seeing them as human, as much human as we see people who we have these specific relationships with. And we all know that if we could see everyone in our community around us like in their wholeness, in their kind of whole flourishing self and their whole suffering self, and all the facets of what make people who they are, how could we then tolerate the fact that a third of children in any class are in poverty? Like, we wouldn't be able to tolerate that if we truly understood that like we all have the same worries, and we all have the same struggles, and we all have the same dreams. So I really like to challenge myself when I feel resourced enough to sort of be playful with that, and to just kind of like be like, how can I push myself to say something that people are going to look at me like, okay, what's her deal? But do it anyway, because how else do we develop like new norms around what it's sort of safe to talk about?
And I suppose, talking of getting to know people, understanding who they are, I was reading the values that you have on your website, Keri. So you've got liberation, revelation, justice, emergence, curiosity, mischief, wholeness, and wonder. And I'm wondering kind of how did you come to those? How did you come to know them? But also, I suppose the bigger question for me is, what do they help you with?
Mm. That's such a good question. I mean, the first thing that came to mind when you said, how did I come to them, is through many, 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 many iterations of my own understanding of who I am and what my work is. So I started my business when my first son was 6 months old, and that was 11 years ago. And it's in practical terms, it's been different things throughout that time. But certainly in terms of my values, it's been different things throughout that time. So whilst now I might talk about liberation, early on in my business, I would have talked about freedom. I would have talked about, I used to do antenatal education, hypnobirthing stuff, and other kind of related things. And I would have talked about like, freedom of personal choice. And, there's nothing wrong with that. Like I still stand by like freedom for people's bodies when they're giving birth and autonomy and all of that. But that sense of a sort of elevating freedom as an ideal really carried through when my work expanded into other areas around work. So I'm really interested in the work of Nora Bateson at the minute. I'm really deeply interested in her work and in her sort of insistence on reminding us over and over and over again about the non-linear nature of our becoming. So as you're asking me this question, my mind is darting off in all these different directions across this like web of time and space where I'm like, oh, that was when I stopped using the word freedom. And that was when I started thinking more in terms of liberation and like what was going on for me there. And I think that was very connected. That particular transition was very connected for me to that period of sort of the end of 2019, that general election that occurred at that time, when it felt like there was all this hope in there, and then suddenly the reality came crashing down around us, which was where the care bank that I co-founded emerged from, the kind of like despair around then. And the sense of how we're going to meet this, like how are we going to respond in our community when it's so predictable how hostile conditions are going to become, even more so than they were at the time for the most marginalized people. So I think that entire era of like late 2019 and then into 2020, and obviously everything that happened as we landed in the pandemic and some personal stuff for me associated with that, was really like a time of reckoning for me, I suppose. So if I think about justice as a concept that feels like really present in all of my work now, again, I would have talked about fairness before. I would have said that like fairness was a value or equality was a value, and wouldn't have been able to speak to like justice and equity. So I don't know to what extent I'm really answering your question here. I'm just kind of meandering around my own thoughts about these values. What do you think?
Yeah, I'm loving your meandering. I suppose maybe my reflection on what you're saying is that your values have changed over time, which I think they do. I think we do this work and we can start to understand what are those values that really core in our DNA that we can't shake off, and what are those values that we've acquired because we're told we should have them. So I spent a lot of time thinking about kindness. Like I would always have said that that's one of my strongest values, but then I spent 10 years thinking about kindness, and by the end of it I was like, I don't want to talk about kindness anymore. I don't want to be kind anymore. And I had like this whole sort of process about what do I mean when I say that. And I suppose the other thing that I'm noticing, and you tell me if I'm wrong, but it feels like your values have, I don't know if this is the right way of saying it, but they've become more about bigger than self. They've become more about universalism and community and togetherness, I suppose, rather than individual freedom of choice, individual fair and being fair to me. Not to say that you were like, it's only about me and no one else, but I think to me, when I look at those values, there's something more connected. There's a connectedness to it, to others.
I think so between like teaching hypnobirthing and other kind of various stages of my business, like I had a studio where we did like pregnancy and parenting stuff. And then I started mentoring other people with like baby related businesses and stuff. And that's really where like coaching beyond what I used to do in my like corporate job came into my work now. And at that time, my context was very much this kind of, online coaching, girl bossy space where that kind of neoliberal vibe, that very much that era. I mean, if people weren't there, it's hard to capture exactly what was going on there. If you were there, you know what I'm talking about. But that kind of, on one hand, really culturally in that space, like really wanting to say, these systems are bad and they're in some ways particularly bad for women. And therefore, our job as coaches is to give women the tools or strategies to like thrive within these systems. And I definitely was part of that. Like I was a client in spaces like that, but I was also a coach like that, trying to, help women to come to terms with their relationships with money so that they could feel more comfortable being more comfortable financially, and also sort of seeking to support women with like boundaries and all these kind of things that we talk about, that they're neutral in some ways on their own, but sort of the context that they were rooted within was very like, we'll admit that these systems are dehumanizing and horrific, and our response to that is to help individual people who, by the way, can afford to pay us to get a little bit better off within that system. And then we had this whole idea that was very prevalent at the time of like, again, like a kind of girl boss version of trickle down economics, like a kind of this like ripple effect. And again, like ripple effects are real, but it's very much like anything we do is justified because we are women, because we kind of like want good things, like a real kind of separation from actually let's interrogate our behaviors. Like, to what extent are we actually doing good things with our power, with our form, with our money? As long as we've got these good intentions and this idea that like one day when we finally have enough, which we all know under capitalism will be never, then I will decide like who is worthy of me giving a bit of money to them, and it'll probably go into a charity where some of it will not end up going to the people who actually I'm kind of deeming worthy of support. And I guess, once I personally became engaged in grassroots mutual aid work, those things just become incompatible. You can't go one morning to hand out nappies and shower gel to people who are prepared to sometimes stand for 2 hours in the rain to get them, and then pick up your phone when you get home and people be talking about, I don't know, abundance orgasms or like 7-figure this, that, and the other, and not feel like, hang on a minute, like something's not kind of stacking up here. So the whiteness of it, the individualism of it, all of that.
That piece around one in the morning, you're talking to someone who is struggling, who's willing to stand in the rain for 2 hours to get some nappies and some food, to then these sort of these other conversations. I'm curious about the care bank. So that came out of, did you say 2020 was when you started to do that? Can you talk a little bit more about that work?
So I have to give all credit to my friend Lauren, who is co-founder of the Care Bank as it stands now. So at the end of 2019, she basically got in touch with people she loosely knew in our area. I mean, we'd never met, we'd never really had a conversation. We just sort of followed each other on Instagram and like liked each other's things and whatever. And she was like, anyone with a feminist perspective basically wants to get together and have a coffee and have a chat about what we could do in our community. So we had this coffee, and I don't know, maybe like 20 people came. A lot of people I knew and some people I didn't really know. And this idea came up about the alleviation of hygiene poverty. And then Christmas, and then New Year and winter, and then COVID. And so because of the pandemic and all of the lockdowns at the beginning, we couldn't actually get started with anything really until the end of 2020 was the first session. And I wasn't there for that, like at the time. That was, I think, 3 of my pals, and I think 7 people turned up. And it was as simple as we just put something on Facebook that was like, will you put some money in this PayPal account if you think that people should be able to afford to wash themselves? And then we all just kind of shared it, and people put money in, and then we used that money to buy some stuff. And we just put in some local Facebook groups, if you're struggling to afford hygiene products in cost of living crisis, just come to this church hall on this day. And people did. So it was so, like now I'm noticing there's such an uptick in people's appetite to get involved in collective care, which is amazing. And I'm also noticing assumptions that it needs to be a certain way, that it needs to be like really well thought through, it needs to be like very organized, that there's some kind of correct way of doing it. And of course, everyone's got to think about their safety and whatnot. But aside from that, it really is like, just start saying things, just start saying that you want to do things and asking people for help and telling people where they can come for help. Anyway, long story short, there were many kind of iterations of how we went about doing that over a few years, and a lot of people coming and going due to the nature of, at the beginning, there were a lot of people who were, say, on maternity leave, who were a part of it, who needed to go back to work, or circumstances changed throughout those few years to the point where we really needed to like bring in reinforcements. Like Lauren and I were really sort of struggling to bear the weight of it. And we also needed much more money at this point than we could reasonably gather up from people we knew and people they knew. So we were kind of forced into registering as a charity, which I now have a lot of mixed feelings about. I really do. But that has allowed us to have the money and the structures in place to be able to continue to support people. So on an average month now, we maybe serve 100 families, and it's a very different thing than it was in some ways, but also the spirit of it remains the same.
If you could have a choice about how you did it, what would that look like?
I mean, if we could have carried on as a grassroots mutual aid initiative, we absolutely would have done that if we had enough money to do that. But so during the time when we still had that structure, we were able to access like some funding pots that had kind of looser criteria around them. But we were just getting to a point where each month we were panicking about how we were going to fund the next month's sessions. And obviously, it's a huge amount of responsibility when people come to expect that you're going to be there, and people obviously come to rely on you, like budget their other spending around, expecting that they can come to you and get these things. And that we lived with a lot of worry about letting people down, about having to make like difficult decisions about what we might cut back on and what people might be allowed to have and whatnot. And that very much flew in the face of what we wanted to do as well. We've always tried to maintain like as much choice and dignity and autonomy throughout all elements of the service as we possibly can. So yeah, if I could like, I mean, obviously, if I could wave a magic wand, then people would just get their basic needs met,
Well,
regardless.
yeah.
But if I could, in terms of sort of this scenario, it would be incredible to be able to put all the energy that we put in directly into this kind of redistribution of resource, rather than some of the bureaucracy that comes with running it the way that we do. But that bureaucracy in the systems that we live in facilitates us being able to access a lot more money to meet these people's needs. So it's a really tricky one.
Yeah, it is really tricky and I think it can, well, I was going to say frustrating. It can feel frustrating, but I don't think that's a strong enough word in many ways. There's a real tension between, I suppose, understanding what is causing the need in the first place and knowing where we would all be better placed putting our time and attention to be more proactive and stopping that in the first place. I spent, well, over 20 years working in different communities and meeting all kinds of people in all kinds of places with all kinds of experiences and different values and different views from me. And it feels very alive. It's an alive problem. It's immediate. It's right there in front of you. And you're trying to support that and support people, but within this bigger context of going, I know what the bigger problem is. Like, I know if we could just sort that bit, then, I wouldn't be having these kind of conversations where people are wondering where their next meal is going to come from. Or so I think there's always that tension, I think, when you're doing that kind of work, is that you want to respond to the immediacy of it, but then how do you also impact or influence that bigger picture stuff?
Also, like, how do we resist? Like, something we've had to think about a lot is the ways in which the systems have kind of colonized, if you like, the work that we do, and trying to move away from that. In terms of, you mentioned that sense of urgency. Like, the urgency is real. Like, people's needs are urgent. Like, these children need to be wearing nappies. Like, the urgency is real. But there are ways in which we notice that we've got really caught up in this, like, everything is urgent, everything is scarce, we need to say yes to everything that anybody ever offers us. Like, we're constantly having to have words with ourselves and one another about, like, what is sustainable in what we're doing here. Like, it is not sustainable for us to be so run ragged every single month that, we become unwell. Like everybody who's involved in this operation is a volunteer. So all the labour is 100% voluntary. Most people have young-ish children. A lot of people have disabilities of their own or are caring for people in their homes with disabilities. Everyone involved has either a job or a business alongside doing this work for free. So it's really difficult to hold that tension, like you say, like where is my energy best placed? Like meeting the immediate need, sustaining the meeting of this kind of need in the medium term, or addressing the big picture issues. And I think a lot in terms of my own, like the sort of blend of my like paid work and unpaid work, and also just like how I show up in my community as a citizen, if you like, about the kind of ecology of all of that. Like I really try to stop myself from getting caught in, I'm not doing enough of that here in this context or here in this context, and just kind of accepting that contributions are best placed, in ways that it might not be that sort of, there's no kind of tick list that I can say, oh, I've like completed that. Like in my activism, I'm meeting this one, I'm meeting this one, I'm meeting this one. I'm not, as someone who basically like co-runs an anti-poverty charity, like I'm not involved in any sort of like campaigning around poverty, or I don't take the time and energy to sort of insert myself into networks where I might learn more about this, or I might get access to people's ears or whatever, because I just don't have the capacity for that. It just doesn't fit with what I can offer if I want to continue to do this work for free, which I do want to do. So it feels like a constant stream of, I don't want to say trade-offs because that sounds like quite limiting and negative in a way, but I guess it's just like activating our own discernment and looking at like, what is going on here for me? Like how much of this is about me? And that comes up for me a lot as well in this work. Like how much of my problem with what I'm doing is about me worrying about being perceived as not doing this well enough, or like perfectly enough, or completely enough, or like professionally enough or something, rather than it actually benefiting anybody else. Like, and actually how might I be taking benefit away from others by me sort of performing this, oh, and I was at this meeting, and oh, I know this person, and I had this impact. Like really kind of disentangling from that need to be able to be seen in the work. And I know that's a bit ironic while I'm like on a podcast talking about doing this work, but really kind of being interested in that.
Yeah.
What I'm saying is I just don't have, that would be at the expense of something else that's like meaningful in my life.
Yeah, and I think what you're saying is it comes back to that self-awareness and really recognizing ourselves in all of that, and what is driving us. So I've talked about this before on my podcast, but if I think about a lot of my work going into working for charities and wanting to help people, some of that came from the fact that I was trying to justify my existence in the world, and I thought people would really like me if I was kind and helpful and not earning very much money because I'm humble and and I think one of the challenges is that a lot of the not-for-profit sector has been built on people wanting to justify their own existence and not getting what they need. So it just what you were saying, it's not sustainable, or they don't, they feel shame if they think, why am I not being recognized for this work? It's very complex, and I think it comes back to just what you were saying. So it's that what is possible for us now, given the polycrisis, Keri, which brings me on to that question. What is a polycrisis?
Well, when I talk about polycrisis, I am talking about this interrelated set of contexts which we are living through that could include, for example, the climate crisis, violence against women and girls, poverty and massive inequity, the kind of fragility in our food systems, obviously connected to the climate crisis, mental and physical health crises and poor provision for healthcare, all the things that plague our lives, thanks so much to systems of oppression, and the ways in and kind of containing then in that language of polycrisis the fact that they are in essence like one thing. They are symptoms of a society where we are motivated. It's interesting, when you were just talking before, I was thinking about intrinsic and extrinsic motivations and how much in our society we are primed for extrinsic motivations. And we could think about that in terms of polycrisis as well, like how much we're all driven to provide for, but go beyond that, really, to sort of climb the ladder for ourselves, for our nuclear families, for people we perceive to be like us, to sort of champion them in some ways. And how that massive inequity is basically, once again, here with the doom and gloom, going to kill us all. Woo!
You heard it here first.
So, we're living through unbearable times. Like, there has not been a day for the last, 400 and something days where I haven't seen an image of a dead child in my phone. Like, we are living through unbearable times. And I guess, in a way, that's the extreme version of, I talked about going to the care bank in the morning and looking on Instagram in the afternoon. This has gone beyond that, obviously, at this point, like looking at a genocide at like 10:01 and someone selling me a Stanley Cup at 10:02, like that. Yeah, the relentless demands on our attention, on us kind of switching modes, on us maintaining this masquerade of consumerist capitalism, whilst also having our eyes open to the realities of imperialism. I mean, when shall I stop?
I was just thinking, gosh, isn't it amazing that we just get up in the morning and we still go on our phones and we still, that I don't know if this is right, the attack on the nervous system, as you say, sort of. So there's so many things to think about, and I keep sort of seeing people talking about how tired they are and how and how exhausted they are, and then sort of thinking, well, I don't know why. I don't know why I'm so tired and exhausted. And it's like, well, we live in unbearable times where, there's just so much stimulation all the time. For some of us, with it, we're really worrying about big existential things and also dealing with the tiny, what am I going to put in the kids' sandwiches? I mean, I don't think that anymore because they're a bit older, but that day-to-day stuff. I suppose the question that I'm thinking about, particularly in terms of this episode, is when we are in that place, well, how do we get up in the morning? How do we, I mean, you talk about it in terms of sort of growing capacity for contribution and for satisfaction. How do we do that when this stuff feels like a giant, heavy rock coming down on us? This is really cheery. Go on.
Well, it's coming out in January as well. It's like, welcome to 2025. So the first thing I want to say is that I think in any situation, like on a podcast, on social media, when we talk about things like this, it's impossible to make it relevant to anyone who might be listening and to kind of cover off all bases of people's experiences. So I want to be clear that what I'm about to say, it may not be appropriate for people depending upon their own like privileges or experiences of oppression, access to resources, safety, all of those things. So I'm going to offer some thoughts and people can kind of meet them, where they are coming from. But I think the first thing that comes up a lot in my client work is really accepting that the experience of becoming different that is required of us is part of the work. It's part of being active. It's part of collective care. I think often people perceive the struggles that they have with coming to terms with the reals, the reality of life around us. People perceive their difficulties with that as a shortcoming. And actually then that feeds into like a spiral of, I'm not enough, I'm not clever enough, I'm not resilient enough, whatever it might be. Whereas actually, if we can perceive our difficulties in navigating all of this as not just a a natural, inevitable response to so much exposure to trauma and horror. And like you say, all of that intermingled with the day-to-day mundane stuff, but also as a kind of almost like the, the knowledge that our bodies and our minds are providing us as they struggle with this is that we are changing. I think we really like to idolize, like glamorize, like, what do I mean? Like, we love to talk about change when it's done. We love to be like, I was there and now I'm here. I'm evolved now. That's like very me. I'm very open to all that kind of thing.
Tick. Next.
But we hate to be in it. We hate to be in the ambiguity, the confusion, the shame, the sort of, we hate being uncertain about who we are. We hate being in that place of like that sort of disrupted self-concept. Who am I and how do I relate to the world as I understand it? And there's so much that we have to be able to let go of if we want to meet the challenges of this moment, if we want to be able to keep like getting out of bed in the morning. And I've been thinking a lot recently about sort of the part that coaching plays in this. And I think it's potentially huge. Like, I think the kind of intervention of, or the modality of coaching has so much potential to support people in that kind of loosening their grip on how they prefer to see themselves. Because I think that so much of our angst around like, how am I functioning? How am I contributing? What are my successes? Like, so much of that is rooted in, how do I need to be seen in order to have a sense that I'm going to belong here? Like, how do I need to be seen to feel like a baseline of psychological safety? And instead, if we can really embrace, like, God, I've got so many things wrong, or I've really misunderstood a lot of things, or I've been very ignorant about a lot of the kind of interrelation between these things that I might have had some knowledge about, but I haven't sort of fully understood. Or maybe I've underestimated my capacity for contribution before, maybe I've been like lulled along. We're very good at coddling one another and being like, you have to take care of yourself. And like, you can't pour from an empty cup. And like, and again, like in some ways, okay. But sometimes I think we can get to a point where we're like, gosh, the world that I live in, whether that's the whole world, my community, the street that I live on, my family unit that I live in, the suffering around us becomes so intolerable that that's having an even greater detrimental impact on us than the work of actually trying to do something about it. So I find myself often having conversations with people, like loose acquaintances, and they'll be like, oh, how's the care bank going? And I'll be like, it's really hard, actually. Like, this is going on. It's pulling me in this direction, this admin thing, this fundraising thing, this volunteer thing, this logistic thing. And also I have this like long-term health problem, and I have these two children who've both currently got health problems. And like, I also run a business, and like, that could be quite demanding. And often get met with, as I'm sure lots of people listening to this will be familiar with, oh, you do too much. You do too much. You need to give yourself a break. And you're literally begging someone to be like, I'll take some of that on. Like, you're literally begging someone to be like, oh, how could I get involved in that? Like, meet me in it. So, but all of us have been that person. Like, I want to put my hands up and like claim, like, 10 years ago when I just had my first child, I actually didn't have any capacity to be thinking beyond really like our day-to-day existences. Like, he never slept. I was very isolated. I was depressed. My family are far away. Like, fair enough, babe. Like, okay, you were doing your best. And so I think the more we can like see ourselves in others as well, that like sometimes I am a proactive person who is like being very aware and doing all the things, and in other chapters of my life I'm not. Then we can also look at the people who we get frustrated with and be like, oh, that was me once. And like, that allows us to realize the potential for that person to transform in their approach as well. Probably answered about 17 different questions you didn't ask then.
I love listening to you. So I think the nature of our conversation that we're having at the moment is indicative of what's happening in our brains and what's happening in our communities and what's happening in our world. It's not straightforward. It's not like, right, Keri, tell me in 3 easy steps how to. because it is so I'm doing this, moving my hands. I used to describe the work that I did as, if I was running a project or something in a community, it was often really messy, it was often really unpredictable. There was a lot of uncertainty, and I had to, I think, get quite good at managing that and not needing it to all be perfect and in easy steps, because things would come up all the time. And I think, if we can develop that, for want of a better word, mindset or perspective, that of course it's all messy, of course it's all unpredictable. We're humans, we're not robots, we're not AI, we're messy, so it makes sense. And to give us that compassion, or to grow our self-compassion, to go, well, it makes sense that you might have thought that at one time, but you don't anymore. So what are you going to do with it? But also recognizing that sometimes, even when you know that stuff, sometimes you're not always going to be able to embrace it and to do the, in air quotes, right thing, the best thing. Sometimes I am unkind, and that's okay. And I would really hope that people can have that with other people around them, and that they can have it with themselves as well, to just not feel like it all has to be so polished and perfect, because that's an impossible endeavor. It's an impossible expectation. But I hear so much of that. Oh, I should have done it this way. I know that it's this. Why did I do it like that? Now I've gone off on a tangent, but it is that remembering that it isn't straightforward.
I think it comes back to like a tangent that's taken us circling back to one of the things we
Yes,
talked
please circle us back.
about small, we talked then about seeing people as more human, and everything about our society is set up for us to view one another, maybe not as machines, but as rational creatures. I'm reading Donut Economics at the minute. There's a lot in there about the rational economic man, and sort of how that gets infused across our lives and our kind of expectations of one another's behaviours and whatnot. Would really recommend it. Very good. But even in those relationships with our children, lots of us are interested in like gentle parenting, natural parenting, like all those ideas. But still, actually, really overall, we live in a culture of, if not authoritarian parenting, then parenting that's like, I guess, like you were like a benevolent manager of your child or something like that, rather than someone who's like in an organic, dynamic relationship with each of you, kind of becoming different in that like field of relation. And I think a lot about that outside of the home and that outside of the parent-child relationship as well, where I don't know if it's easier or harder, is it, to say to our friends or to our colleagues, like, maybe I didn't quite get that right in terms of how I responded to you. And these kind of walls that are put between us in terms of like processes and like professionalism and all that kind of expectation, when actually like often we just want to like look somebody in the eye and like go towards them and tell them like, oh, I'm sorry that I hurt you, and like, I would love it to be acknowledged that I was also hurt here. And so yeah, just thinking about that across different contexts, and that seeing each other as human just feels so important, but we're not equipped for that.
Yeah. How do we get, in your experience, how can you help yourself feel better equipped for that?
I think it really comes back to loosening our grip on how we see ourselves. So if I need to come away from an interaction knowing that I have, like, my priority has been protecting that I will be perceived as, I get to really cling on to, like, I am clever, I am kind, like whatever it is. Like all of my energy is going into that, and I'm not really listening to what the other person needs. I'm not really responding to them. I've got my blinkers on. I'm like moving down this path that gets me the outcome that I want, which is that I think a lot of the time what we want is I come away unchanged. Like I don't have to give anything in terms of my perception of myself. Whereas if we go into a conversation willing to learn something about ourselves, maybe I'm not as kind as I thought I was, maybe I'm not as fair, maybe I haven't been as clever here. Really that shift in, this is who I am, and these are the behaviors that I value and prioritize. But in that, knowing that I won't always be able to uphold those behaviors, but we can only loosen those grips when there is sufficient psychological safety, and we're not practiced in creating psychological safety for one another, because we think that, you know, the ways that we cultivate belonging are by doing things like buying things and, you know, signaling status and treating someone to something, and rather than that kind of intimacy of, we had this conflict, we both talked about how we felt and how we weren't like proud of our behaviors, and now we get like what's actually like, you know, sorry to be cringe, but like actual abundance. Like we had this real human connection, like, you know, this it's real. We had something like really real, rather than I got to maintain a sort of performance or facade.
Mm. So we've talked a lot. We've gone all over the shop, all over the houses. What for you has resonated most in this conversation?
Mm. For me has resonated most. I suppose the standout theme for me is probably this idea of no perfect ways of doing things, no correct ways, no perfect ways, only experiments. One of my favorite, or probably actually, yeah, I'm going to say my favorite book from the last few years is Lola Olufemi's Experiments in Imagining Otherwise. And I love everything about that text. I love the way that it's presented. I love all the different styles within it. It's like this blend of like fiction and poetry and prompts and empty space for yourself. And it's really supported me to get into this mindset of experimentation. And, you know, somewhere in that book, she writes, like, I've already outgrown everything I've ever written. And I just find it so, like, such a liberation from the idea that I have to do anything correctly. She talks as well about, you know, the book's already a failure. Like, it's so not like any other book. So almost like, you know, the only way is up from here. Like, I've presented it to you as a failure, and then sort of take what you want from it. And I try to really take that approach into my activism, my family life, like the various ways that I show up, my work. And there in that space, you know, really recognizing that alongside that embracing of it being imperfect and it being experimental, if I can locate myself within like a wider ecology of all these other people experimenting, trying this, trying that, doing the bits that they can, then that feels like, okay, like, all right, like this is enough. Like I don't need personal recognition. I need to look around and see that, like, oh, we are shifting some stuff very slowly, very inconsistently, very unpredictably, but there are people out there alongside me in the web of life who are, you know, on board with me, experimenting our way through.
And I was thinking about your group well, it's not a group program, compost. I'm going to let you describe it. But then I was thinking, but does that then sound like we've gone into, and now we're going to sell a thing to help you with all of this stuff?
Yeah, I mean, maybe the second Friday of each month is a free gathering. So long story short, composting, you might call it a membership. We don't call it a membership, but that's kind of like the closest thing that is like language that people are familiar with, I suppose. It's on the Portal Collective. The Portal Collective is a new emerging platform for online course building and learning without hierarchies, with really inspired by permaculture principles. So Sally is the founder and the I don't know, the inventor, the world builder, adventurer.
Yeah, let's
all those things. All my group work takes place on there. I absolutely love it. I really believe in putting my money where my mouth is and divesting from big tech as much as I possibly can. And also just in really being willing to be in an experimental place. It is new, it is awaiting investment, you know, it is imperfect. And I actually really love that about it. Like, oh, we're over here, like we'll do anything to get away from those guys. Like we're over here. You know, it's wonderful. So many great people on there. Anyway, we do this thing called composting. And really, the essence of it was inspired by a Donna J. Haraway quote where she talks about, I'm going to like absolutely slaughter this quote now, but she basically says, we require each other in unexpected collaborations and combinations in hot compost piles. We become with one another or not at all. I might need to check the order of some of those words, but that's the essence of it. And really the idea was like, what would happen if we just got a load of people together who really care about collective care, and we just had a few prompts each month. We just have a few quotes from thinkers who I think are interesting, and they're accompanied by a few prompts in terms of how they land with each person. And then we discuss the prompts. And then we have a couple of coaching calls that address things that have emerged from the prompts. And it's extremely informal and casual and organic. Never really know what's going to happen in the sessions. There's no particular outcome promised. Essentially, it is about really valuing that. How do we become different in community? If I express an experience that I've had and other people are able to share that they've had something similar, they may not be saying, and this is what I've done about it. There may be no solutions offered. It might just be like a sense of not alone in this, actually, and other people see the world the way that I do. I think of it sometimes as a bit of a sanity check for people as well. It's a place where you can come and speak freely with your worldview intact, that people should get their basic needs met without needing to constantly second guess and like caveat yourself and like worry about people seeing you in certain ways. It's just it's a space where it's normal to think like that, which is actually quite a relief to land in a place like that.
Yeah, I just wrote down the word not strive, well, 2 words, not striving as you were talking, because I think, and there are values. I've run these sorts of programs before where, there is something you want to, there is a particular outcome that you're looking for, and you might want accountability or whatever it is, but there is this increasingly, and I'm seeing more and more of this work where there are these spaces where we don't need to be anything, or we don't need to have a list of actions at the end. That actually, it's that word for me again about witnessing. We are witnessed in our thinking, in our messiness, in our unpredictability, in our wandering thoughts, our half-formed thoughts. No, it's a really lovely space, and having done some work with you, Keri, I can totally recommend working with Keri. That piece about it being informal, about it's a curious space, not a judgmental one, and yeah, I would really recommend, if you haven't connected with Keri, to do so immediately after this podcast is finished. I'll put everything in the show notes. So, how else can people find you if they want to know more?
Very sadly, I am still active on Instagram, so you can come and find me there. I'm really doing my best to. It's a lot to come to terms with. What does it mean to be on there, Sarah? What does it mean to be feeding the death machine? All of that. I'm also on LinkedIn, but like hardly ever. And my website looks nice. I had some brilliant work done on my website by Louise at 626. So that's just kerijarvis.com. But basically, let's face it, Instagram is where I spend most of my waking hours.
Thank you, Keri. I know we sort of gone in lots of different places, but I really appreciate being able to have that space with you. And I've just noticed the time. We've gone way over.
There's plenty to cut.
I'm not sure I will.
Have fun.
Maybe there's a couple of episodes. I'll divide it into 2. But thank you. I really appreciate it. Look after yourself.
Thank you. Thanks so much for having me.
Where did your curiosity go when you were listening to that? What resonated? We would love to know. Come and find me on LinkedIn. I'm at Sarah Fox Coach, or you can sign up to my weekly letter to founders and leaders who want to make a difference without breaking. Take very good care.